Well, let's hear another story from
And
Fran.
then we can chit-chat. And
Because this story's not very tame. We don't know how long it's going to be.
it's a youngster.
Yes.
Tell on.
Thank you. And I guess this would fit under the sticky situations category, I think. So when Jay and I first moved to the Adirondacks in 1968, we began hearing about and learning about Virgil and Caroline Bartlett. These were names that went well back in the history of this piece of property. They were the first people that ever set foot that we know of. Of course, there were Native Americans before that, but who came to this same property in 1854. That's when they came. And when they came, they couldn't come by car. There were no roads. There were no automobiles. The river, the water was their highway. And they came from Saranac Lake 15 miles away, so they had to paddle or row upstream 15 miles before they could step out on the shore of the river right before it went up the rapids and up to upper Saranac Lake. They wanted to build a place for sports, as they called them then, which were men usually, but men and women who wanted to go out hunting and fishing and just being out in the wilderness. And they wanted to have a place where they could come and spend the night and have good food. Caroline was a great cook. So that was their intention. But when they stepped on the shore in 1854, there were no buildings. They just looked at this forest of deep pine trees, virgin pine trees, huge pine trees, went up well over 100 feet, every one of them. And they knew that they would be sawing those down, literally sawing them with cross-cut saws or chopping them with axes to finally build the Sportsman's Lodge, Bartlett Sportsman's Lodge. Well, when Jay and I came, over 100 years later, in 1968, we had buildings. We had 37 buildings. None of them were the ones from Virgil and Caroline's day. They had long gone. But we did have these buildings, and we knew we needed to do something about renovating them, and we were not sure yet exactly what that would be. But as we looked at these buildings and we started thinking about which would we keep, which would we tear down, we were thinking, I know I was, and I'm sure Jay was, we never talked about it a lot out loud, but could we do this? If we put in all this time and effort and money, would it work? Would people want to come? And I'm sure Virgil and Caroline must have been wondering the same thing. I have no doubt of it. Well, fast forward 12 years to 1980, August 1980. We had made it work. We now had 9 houses. We had gotten rid of a lot of them, but we had 9 houses ranging in size from 2 to 5 bedrooms. We called them lodges, and each one was self-sufficient. Each one had a kitchen, a dining room, a fireplace, at least one fireplace, bathrooms, indoor plumbing, electricity. It was great. It was the works. And we had families that loved to come. They came back year after year. And they wanted to come when their other families that they'd met there came, because now their kids were friends. So during the summer months, it was just packed, and everyone was having a great time. Well, on this one day in August, it was a stormy day, a dark and stormy day, and it was raining. If you were here in Albany, New York today, I would say it's raining like today, only even harder, just torrential rain and wind, not just a little breeze, but this wind just whipping around the trees. So it was quite a day, but Jay and I were up at the club running around as we usually were, taking care of this and that. And at midday, we finally managed to find about a half hour that we could go home. We lived about half a mile away to have lunch. So we were having lunch when there was a rap on the door. It was Pete. Pete was our right-hand man, maintenance guy. He supplied the firewood. He took care of the grounds. He fixed things when they needed fixing. There he was at our screen door. Jay, you've got to come now. You know that pine tree right outside of Hemlock Lodge, the big one? It looks like it's going to fall, and it could fall right on the roof. Jay went to the phone. He called up Carl. He was our neighbor 2 miles up the road, and Carl was a caretaker up there, but also a woodsman. He knew a lot about trees and how to take them down in the right way. And Carl said, I'll be right there, and I'll bring Tom. Tom was his son-in-law, and Tom knew a lot about the woods as well. Jay and I got in the truck, we followed Pete, and went right up to the club. And when we got out in the parking lot, I heard something. Now, you may have heard the wind in pine trees, you know, a breeze going through them, that sighing or whispering sound. That wasn't what I was hearing. This was a howling, a real howling up in the trees, and I looked up and the wind was just whipping those top branches back and forth, and the whole trunks of these trees, they were just swaying back and forth. We ran over to Hemlock Lodge. It was one of our 9 lodges that we had. This was a little one. It just had 2 bedrooms. We had just finished renovating it about 3 years earlier. Jay had just built a new staircase going up to the porch and put in a kitchen, and I'd sewed all the curtains, and here was this pine tree that was about to fall on it. It also had a family that was staying in it, George and his wife. George was a scientist, and his wife and his kids and dogs, and they'd all managed to get out. They were out, but still inside was the mother and baby opossum that they had brought up with them. And we didn't dare let them go back in to get the opossums. We just had to hope they would be okay. So we ran up, and there was Hemlock Lodge, and 15 feet away, here was this tree, this pine tree. It was so big, that trunk, that 2 people standing on either side could barely touch their hands. And up about 20 feet, the pine tree, the trunk split into 2 trunks that went way up about 100 feet altogether. And each of those 2 trunks was about the size of one regular size tree. And at some point, no one knows exactly when, those 2 trunks that were like this, down at the bottom, they started a crack into the main trunk. And now with the wind whipping the top, the crack was growing by the minute with the wind whipping up there. And they knew they had to do something. So Jay and Tom and Carl got into a huddle and started a quick talk about what they were going to do. Pete went to get the bulldozer, and then they got some ropes and tied them around the tree, and they began to winch the tree back and tie them to other trees so it wouldn't fall, they hoped, on Hemlock Lodge. They wanted to try to make sure that didn't happen, and they wanted to winch it away from these other buildings over here as well. And then Tom got a ladder, and he put it up against that big old craggy bark, and he started climbing up the ladder with a 3/4 inch rope coiled at his waist. He said, I had to get up there to stabilize the tree before we could cut it down. And he said when he climbed all the way to the top, by this time, by the way, all the guests from all of the lodges had heard of the commotion and come out. It's still pouring rain. Nobody cared. And they're just watching this drama unfold. And there is Tom climbing up this ladder, and the wind is whipping, and they could see the tree swaying. Would the tree knock the ladder and Tom down? Would the wind whip him off? Would he make it? And he managed to get up there, and he said later, when I got up there and I was right by those 2 trunks, it was like a mouth opening and closing, opening and closing. And somehow he managed to get the rope around those 2 trunks to stabilize them before they could cut the tree down. And as he started down, this great sigh of relief from everyone watching. And meanwhile, Carl had been pacing off. He judged that tree about 100 feet. He paced off 100 feet, and he figured exactly where he wanted that tree to fall. So it would go between these other buildings and definitely away from Hemlock, and hopefully not hurt any building in its fall. And he stood about 100 feet off with his pipe in one hand and his axe in the other, and he said, yeah, she's going to fall right about here. Well, once all that was done, Carl and Tom started up their chainsaws, revved them up, and those chainsaws. Now, I don't know a lot about how to cut a tree down, but I know there's a way you can do it to hopefully make it go in a certain direction and not in another direction. Something about wedging, and I just don't know. But they knew, that's why they were there, and I was just watching. And so those chainsaws started screaming and whining, and it seemed to go on for the longest time. And every once in a while, one of the chainsaws would quit because they'd run out of gas, or another one would get stuck, and they'd have to figure out how to unstick it. And then they'd be screaming and whining, and then finally, the chainsaw stopped. Tom and Carl had done whatever they could do. And everybody watching looked up at that tree, and as if choreographed, they started backing up because the tree began to lean, just slightly at first, and it started to groan as it was leaning. And it leaned and it groaned, and it leaned and it groaned. And then the top branches started cracking against other branches as it hit it, and then finally, whomp! That tree landed on the ground. And every foot felt the reverberation of that fall. It had stopped raining, but quite a few people were wiping their eyes, not because of the rain. And then George's little girl, the one who'd been in Hemlock, she walked up to the tree, and with her little arms, she tried to hug it the best she could. And then others came up and laid their hands against the craggy bark of that tree. And then George, the scientist, said, "Let's go find out how old this tree was." We all thought that was a great idea, and we went over to the stump of this tree, this huge golden yellow stump with this pungent scent of pine sap coming up. And he started counting the rings with a lot of help from little fingers, so he had to start over a bunch of times. And finally he finished, he said, 126 years. That's how old this tree was. 126 years. That meant this tree started growing in 1854. The same year that Virgil and Caroline stepped out of their boat onto the shore on the hill below and looked up at that pine tree forest and thought about the building that they would build. Little did they know then that while they were standing there up on another hill, a little chute was coming out of the humus and the soil, a little chute that would grow for 126 years. And little did we know, as we stood there mourning the loss of this giant, smelling that pungent pine sap, and looking up at the gap in the sky where this tree had just stood. Little did we know what little shoot might be coming out of the ground right then somewhere else on the property, some little shoot that would grow and grow and grow. And who knew what story that tree would have to tell?
Whoa.
Whoa.
Whoa. Oh, man.
And that's just 2 stories from this book. Just 2.
Boy, you tied a lot of things together in that story. That was really remarkable. I mean, so much about the people who were visitors and living there in UNJ, and then the personality of the trees.
Oh, yeah.
That was something else.
And the
That was
hole
really
in the
something else.
sky.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of wonderful images.
They just now do you write poetry at all?
I do, not a lot,
Not
but
a lot.
I do write some poetry.
Because sometimes in your cadence, it really is poetry, and it's really kind of fun to hear.
Thank you.
So we have less than 2 minutes. Is there any last thing you'd like to say about your book before we say goodbye to you?
Oh, I'm so happy it's out. I'm so glad she graduated and she's out in the world. And I love to hear people's stories, their own stories that are generated because of the book. Yeah.
Do you have another book in your battery or near your heart?
Yes.
Oh, you do? Oh, wonderful. Great. So we could have another show.
Tell us a little bit.
Oh, it's such a story, but it's a completely different thing. It is about my grandmother, who in the 1930s went to Japan to study Zen Buddhism, and she lived and studied in a Zen Buddhist monastery. And I've been to that monastery twice now, so there's a lot of mystery and a very interesting time in the mid 1930s in Japan.
A lot of change going on there. That's when the whole infrastructure changed.
Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So thank you, Fran, so much for coming.